The crowd fell silent, not the usual silence of anticipation before an execution, but something heavier, something that made even the most hardened spectators of the guillotine shift uncomfortably where they stood. On July 17, 1794, at the height of the Reign of Terror's bloodiest phase, something happened at the Place du Trône Renversé that Paris had never witnessed before. 16 women climbed the scaffold steps that afternoon, and as each one faced death, they sang. This wasn't supposed to happen. By the summer of 1794, public executions had become theatre for the masses. Crowds gathered daily to watch the condemned ride past in wooden carts, to hear them plead or curse or weep. The Revolutionary Tribunal had perfected the machinery of death, processing cases with industrial efficiency. But these 16 women, members of the Carmelite monastery at Compiègne, transformed their execution into something the revolution couldn't control. They died as they had lived, in prayer and in defiance of a state that had tried to erase them. 10 days later, the architects of the terror would fall. Many in France believed the nuns' deaths hastened the end of the killing. Whether divine intervention or coincidence, what happened that summer afternoon remains one of the revolution's most haunting moments. The Revolutionary Tribunal's verdict: 16 nuns sent to the guillotine. The Carmelite community at Compiègne had survived nearly a year in hiding before the Committee of Public Safety found them. When the revolution abolished religious orders in 1790 and declared all vows null, the 20 sisters refused to scatter. They divided into 4 small groups, renting apartments in separate houses across Compiègne, living as civilians but maintaining their prayers in secret. Each morning they gathered at a local church where a disguised Jesuit priest, Father de la Marche, offered Mass for them. They had one set of civilian clothing each, not by choice, but because they couldn't afford more. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, born Madame Lidoine, led them through those months with quiet determination. The great niece of King Louis XIV's minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Mother Henriette of Jesus, lived among them. So did Sister Constance, at 29 the youngest of the group. The oldest, Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified, had lived 78 years. They came from different backgrounds, different social classes, but they shared a single purpose that the revolution considered criminal. They believed some things mattered more than the state. On June 21, 1794, agents of the Committee of Surveillance raided all 4 apartments simultaneously. They tore through the sisters' meager possessions, searching for evidence. They found it. A portrait of King Louis XVI, a prayer to the Sacred Heart of Jesus for the king's protection. Proof that the nuns continued living as a religious community despite the law. The next day, soldiers returned with arrest warrants. 16 sisters were taken. 3 had been away visiting family and escaped. The arrested nuns were locked in a former visitation convent that now served as a makeshift prison, joining 17 English Benedictine nuns already detained there. 20 days later, on July 12th, the mayor of Compiègne burst into the prison with soldiers and a transport order. The nuns were being transferred to Paris for trial. There was a problem. Their only civilian clothes were soaking in wash water. The mayor, faced with a schedule he couldn't delay, made a decision that would become historically significant. The nuns would travel to Paris in their outlawed religious habits. They arrived at the Conciergerie prison in Paris that same day, wearing the brown wool robes and white veils that marked them as Carmelites, as consecrated women. The Conciergerie served as the antechamber of death during the terror. Most prisoners spent 1 or 2 nights there before facing the Revolutionary Tribunal. The nuns spent 5. During those days, they recanted the civic oath they'd been forced to take years earlier. They knew what was coming. Mother Teresa, understanding the brutal efficiency of the executioner's assistants who cut away clothing and hair from victims' necks before the blade fell, spent part of that time sewing. She made 16 white caps from whatever cloth she could find, caps that would cover her daughters' heads and spare them at least the executioner's rough hands on their hair. On July 17th, the nuns were led before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The law of 22 Prairial, passed just over a month earlier, had stripped away any pretense of legal process. No defense counsel, no witnesses. Only two possible verdicts: acquittal or death. The jury could convict based on what they called moral certainty, which meant political necessity. The public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had sent more than 2,000 people to the guillotine by that summer. He processed cases with mechanical precision, sometimes 30 in a day. The 16 nuns stood before the court weak from hunger but unbowed, wearing their habits. Their closely cropped hair was covered by Mother Teresa's hand-sewn caps. The charges read like a catalogue of thought crimes: counter-revolutionary fanaticism, maintaining religious gatherings, refusing to embrace Republican values, harbouring royalist sympathies. Sister Mary Henrietta, one of the older nuns, asked the prosecutor to define fanaticism. She pretended not to understand the term, forcing him to explain that their fanaticism consisted of their religious beliefs, which made them, in his words, criminals and annihilators of public freedom. Mother Teresa claimed full responsibility. She defended her sisters, insisted on their innocence, tried to take the entire weight of the accusations onto herself. It made no difference. The tribunal had already decided. All 16 were sentenced to death by guillotine. The sentence would be carried out that same afternoon. Between their conviction and execution, they were permitted one request. They asked for a pail of hot water. They washed their soiled civilian clothes and returned to their habits, the garments they would die in. Cart to the scaffold, the process of public guillotine executions in Paris. The tumbrils waited in the courtyard of the conciergerie. These two-wheeled wooden carts, originally designed for hauling animal manure, had become the revolution's standard transportation for the condemned. Each cart could hold 12 people. The nuns needed 2. The executioner maintained a fleet of 8 to 10 such carts specifically for this purpose. Most remained unpainted, though some political prisoners rode in carts painted red, as if their blood needed advertising before it was spilled. The prison bell rang. The nuns gathered in the courtyard area known as the Corner of the 12, where condemned prisoners assembled before their final journey. Guards bound their hands behind their backs. Then the sisters climbed into the carts without assistance. No struggling, no weeping. They arranged themselves as best they could on the hard wooden benches, their habits settling around them. The carts lurched forward through the prison gates into the Paris streets. The route from the conciergerie to the Place du Trône Renversé covered roughly 3 miles through the heart of Paris. The journey typically took between 2 and 3 hours. Not because of distance, but because executions were public theatre. The carts moved slowly through crowded streets, giving spectators time to gather, to jeer, to throw refuse at the condemned. The revolution wanted everyone to see what happened to enemies of the state. The mob usually obliged with enthusiasm, pressing close to the tumbrils, shouting insults, spitting at prisoners who rode past. But this procession was different. As the carts rolled through the streets, the nuns began to sing. First, the Miserere, the great psalm of repentance. Then, the Office of Readings, prayers they'd recited together for years in their cloistered monastery. The Salve Regina followed, the ancient hymn to the Virgin Mary that Carmelites had sung for centuries. Their voices rose above the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, above the noise of Paris itself. The crowd's usual roar began to fade. People fell silent as the singing nuns passed. Some accounts describe an unprecedented quiet descending over the streets that afternoon. Others note that onlookers seemed moved, perhaps reminded of a France that had existed before the revolution devoured its own children. The nuns sang the Office of the Dead for all those who had gone before them to the guillotine. They sang for France itself and Paris, for once, listened. The guillotine had been moved to the Place du Trône Renversé only a month earlier. Maximilien Robespierre had ordered it relocated from the center of Paris because he planned a celebration of his cult of the Supreme Being at the Place de la Révolution. The grim aftermath of the Daily Terror along the Procession route would have interfered with the solemnity of his festival. So the killing machine was dismantled and rebuilt at what is now the Place de la Nation in eastern Paris. Between June 13th and July 27th, 1794, 1,306 people were guillotined at this location. Their tragic remains were buried in mass graves nearby. The scaffold stood roughly 15 feet high, built from heavy timber with stairs leading up the back and an open platform surrounded by railings on 3 sides. The guillotine itself consisted of 2 upright posts about 15 feet tall, set 15 inches apart, with metal-lined grooves allowing the weighted blade to drop freely. The blade was triangular, attached to a heavy weight called the mouton, that added 66 pounds of force to ensure a clean cut. At the business end of the device was the bascule, a bench-like plank that tilted forward, and the lunette, a wooden yoke that held the victim's neck in place. On one side of the scaffold sat large baskets painted red to receive the remains of the condemned. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, worked with 5 to 8 assistants who managed the physical process of execution. They led victims up the stairs, positioned them on the bascule, secured the lunette around their necks, and released the blade. The entire process, from stepping onto the scaffold to death, took less than a minute per person when the executioners worked efficiently. On busy days during the terror, they processed dozens of victims in a few hours. Final prayers at the place of execution. How the guillotine was carried out. The carts arrived at the Place du Trône Renversé in late afternoon. The nuns continued singing as they descended from the tumbrils. They sang the Veni Creator Spiritus, calling on the Holy Spirit. 24 other condemned prisoners waited with them that day, but history remembers only the 16 who sang. The sisters formed a line, and one by one they approached Mother Teresa. Each knelt before her and asked the question they'd been trained to ask since entering religious life. Permission to die, Mother? Mother Teresa held a small statuette of the Virgin Mary, no bigger than her hand. Each sister kissed it before ascending the scaffold steps. Each received a final blessing from their prioress. The executioner's assistants allowed them to complete the prayers for the dying. The unusual cooperation might have been professional courtesy, or maybe even these men, who'd grown callous after months of killing, felt something sacred happening that afternoon. Sister Constance, the youngest, went first. Contemporary accounts describe her waving aside the executioner and his assistants, climbing the scaffold stairs unaided. She renewed her religious vows at the top of the platform, speaking clearly enough for her sisters below to hear. Then she positioned herself without assistance. The assistants secured her on the bascule, the tilting plank that brought her body horizontal. They placed her neck in the lunette, the wooden yoke designed to hold it steady. The executioner released the déclic, the catch holding the blade. The mouton and blade fell. Death came in a fraction of a second. The executions continued in order of religious profession, youngest to oldest. Each sister climbed the stairs, renewed her vows, and submitted to the blade. The crowd remained eerily quiet. Usually spectators cheered at executions, jeered at victims, celebrated each falling blade. But that afternoon, they stood in silence as the singing grew softer with each death. 16 voices became 15, 15 became 14. Each time the blade fell, another voice was silenced, and the hymn they were chanting grew fainter. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified, at 78, the oldest of the group, was heard to say to the executioners, "I forgive you, my friends. I forgive you with all that longing of heart with which I would that God forgive me." Her words carried across the platform across the silent crowd. Then she climbed the steps and placed herself under the blade. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine was the last. She'd watched 15 of her daughters die before ascending the scaffold herself. She'd blessed each one, held the statue of Mary for each to kiss, spoken the words, "Go, my daughter," 15 times. Now she stood alone. The accounts say she climbed with perfect composure, renewed her vows in a clear voice, and positioned herself on the bascule without hesitation. The blade fell for the 16th and final time. The bodies of all 16 nuns were thrown into a mass grave with the other victims of that day's executions. 10 days later, on July 27, 1794, the National Convention arrested Maximilien Robespierre. The following day, he and 21 of his closest allies were guillotined. The reign of terror ended. In the weeks that followed, the Revolutionary Tribunal itself was dismantled. The rate of executions dropped dramatically. By the end of August, the period historians call the Great Terror had concluded. Many French Catholics believed the nuns' sacrifice had brought about this change, that their deaths somehow broke the fever of violence consuming France. The 3 Carmelite sisters who'd escaped arrest survived the revolution. One of them, Marie de l'Incarnation, wrote an account of the executions that was published in 1836. The story spread through Catholic Europe. In 1906, Pope Pius II beatified the 16 martyrs, the first victims of the French Revolution to be officially recognized by the Church. Their feast day was set as July 17th, the date of their execution. On December 18th, 2024, more than 2 centuries after their deaths, Pope Francis declared them saints through a process called equipollent canonization. The site of their execution, the Place du Trône Renversé, is now called the Place de la Nation. Parisians pass through it daily on their way to work, to market, to ordinary life. The mass graves where the victims of 1794 were buried lie beneath a nearby church. The names of all 1,306 people guillotined at that location are inscribed on marble plaques covering the walls. Among them are the 16 Carmelites, who sang their way to death while Paris fell silent and listened. If you had stood in that crowd on July 17, 1794, watching 16 women climb the scaffold one by one, singing prayers as the blade fell and their voices disappeared into silence, would you have cheered with the mob or stood quiet in the face of such conviction? The French Revolution promised liberty, equality and fraternity, but in its most terrible hour it was 16 cloistered nuns who showed France what those words might actually mean.